Indie games are a lot like plants. They all come in different shapes, sizes, colors, and each of them have their own watering plan, aka marketing, that they need to succeed. Some will need a little bit more sun, while others will grow just by their sheer placement in the soil. And if you're not careful, you may end up with an excess of them even though you have a backlog. Okay, wait, I'm talking about games there, but that's okay. Hell, we have a lot of plants in the house. Like, a lot of them. There may be as many plants in this house as there are in this game. You're seeing them on screen right now. Don't you like weird intros? Strange Horticulture released on January 21st, 2021 on the PC on both the Epic Game Store and Steam for $14.99. It's a puzzle game that may remind those of games like Papers, Please, but happening in a plant shop and not on a border, living in a fantasy-like world with different people, agendas, and a whole lot of plants. You play as an unnamed botanist, taking over an interesting plant shop from a family member who died. And while you don't really get to see who you are and really get to know who this character is, that's purposeful. It's really about you putting yourself into this lady's shoes and your own personality into her, because this game isn't going to really give you much more than how people react to her, and even then, it'll be hard to tell who this person is. Regardless, you take over this shop in a semi-fantasy world, and from the get-go, it feels like there's a reasonable element of realism present here. While there are things in the game like rituals and castles and whatnot, your primary purpose is to be the shop owner in a tale that is cast throughout this imaginary world, and you're not doing extraordinary things, at least at first, but serving a part in a bigger story. I emphasize this because of the fact that the grounded nature of the game is one of its bigger strengths, especially when it comes to pairing with the gameplay overall. Which, let's start to describe that, shall we? There's two major mechanics, and let's start with the shop one. When ready, you'll hit the bell, and a client will come into your shop. That person will give you some sort of requirement for the plant they are looking for, whether it be the straight name of the plant, an explanation of what they need the plant to do, or maybe even just a description of how it looks. You have to use these clues by going into your encyclopedia of plants that only start with a few identifications at first, and use the information to give the client what they need. In most cases, there's only one plant that fits the bill, and if you get it wrong, you start a failure meter in the bottom corner. Fill it up, and it's game over, and you'll have to restart the day. Now no, your family apparently sucks at their job, because the plants they left you are unidentified. So that encyclopedia will be important to look at drawings and the descriptions to make that right choice. Maybe even using the tools, such as this more detailed element here that will give a description of what the plant feels like or looks like, or even the magnifying glass to get a closer look. When you do get it right, you probably want to label that plant at this point with the tags here, although there is an option in the menus to auto-identify on success. That's not all you do, however, as in between requests, you'll be able to explore the world on a map, and this is used to find new plants and identifications that you'll need to make future requests. Most of the time, you'll get a clue of what you're looking for from other clients that come in, via letters or even word of mouth. Now, just like the plants section, you'll have to follow these clues to figure out what specific location on the map they're talking about. Now, unlike the in-store section of gameplay, failure here means that you just waste your time, and you can either do it at a later time when you've built up your travel meter, or just water your plants to earn that meter right now. When first streaming the game over on Twitch, link in the description, I was really liking this core gameplay loop, and games like Papers, Please came up in my head for what I relate the experience to. The game does a great job of introducing mechanics little by little, and upping the difficulty little by little to get you accustomed to those mechanics and not push you overboard. Things like finding hidden messages on cards, or even using a note in an unexpected way, like the border of the card being the clue itself, made me think about things from different angles, yet didn't overly stress me out here. The game does enough to make you really look for a keyword that matches your dictionary, or even the drawing in the encyclopedia, because you can easily make mistakes here. Some plants do look like each other, and some of the descriptions will force you to really investigate closely because it's probably not the first plant that you see on the shelf that fits the general description. I made mistakes at times that were almost always my fault because I just made an assumption, and that was the game punishing me properly. Well, most of the time at least. See, if you're not doing the map portion of the game and staying on top of the clues you're getting from that, it's easy for you to run into a request where you don't have the right plant right now, and in that case, you could be guessing with the plants you have over and over again, thinking that you're just not understanding what the game is telling you. Sometimes it's not obvious, only that, hey, you don't actually have it and need to find that plant. However, there is a way to immediately tell that, and this is where I get a little iffy about the game's mechanics. The game has a hint system that will help you out in those times of stress. Those hints have levels. The first one will give you a general idea if you have the plant right now. Then it'll tell you what the plant is, but not exactly which plant on the shelf it is with the second hint. On the third hint, it'll give you a group of 5 plants that you have and tell you to pick one out of the 5, and that's it. These levels of hints allow players who aren't as good at finding the details and clever solutions out, and in particular the first level of hints tells you, hey, you need to go do that other section of gameplay because you could sit here all day and try to match it, but you don't have it. But I will admit, that hint system wasn't really taught well at first, and didn't give that description of how the hints were told to you. It's something I figured out later. So if you're running into those problems with identifying a plant that you don't have for the first time, you basically have to give up and hit the hint button in order to make progress, which for some types of players will really be a downer. But it also brings up another problem: some of the map clues. See, let's say you don't want to use the hint system. You're stubborn and want to figure out all the clues for yourself. And maybe you want to come back to one when you get the right state of mind. Maybe you want to just skip this request and maybe come back to it. Well, you can't. See, this game is on rails, and you have to do it in a certain order. Even when you do have a choice of which plant to give, you still have to present a plant in the end, and 95% of the time, you need a singular one, which will be gotten through a specific map investigation or clue, which means you can't skip over things due to the way the failure state is designed. Which leads me into another point, and where I think the Papers, Please comparison that I've been seeing repeatedly, and hell, even I used it earlier in this video, starts to break down. The game's on-rails nature means that experimenting in the context of the game doesn't happen, and I feel like that was a huge missed opportunity. For the sake of not explicitly pointing out a spoiler for use in this point, I'm going to parallel a possible scenario in the game for where I feel that the game could have been improved from a gameplay standpoint. Now, I know what people are thinking based on what you've seen so far. I posted some spoilers in terms of the story for the characters that I've shown, but they're not in context, and so where they happen in the story and what they actually refer to, you can't make the connection on. It's all chopped up, and thus, I don't consider it as much of a spoiler. But anyway, in this scenario, let's consider a person who comes into the plant shop looking for something to help them sleep. The thing is, there's a couple of houses over that are making a lot of noise. Some noises that are unnatural, and it is a little bit scary, to be honest. So yes, I could give them something to help them sleep. But the thing is, that means they're going to be coming back over and over and over again, because it may not go away. So what if I were to give them something that helped them out in a different way? You know, something that gave them a little bit of courage to actually go look at what is making the noise. It's a different solution, And it is one that could have consequences. The fact is, the noise could be something unnatural or, something that could actually hurt them. But it would also be a solution that may actually fix the problem over time. So the thing is, in the scenarios of the game, there are ones that are similar to that, where there's a first interaction that may be light, maybe something that helps them fall asleep or helps them, put their visions in their mind. But then they come back later on with something that they need a little bit more help on, something that escalates from that original decision. That maybe I have a soft progression so that I skip one of the 2 steps, or maybe I go to a different storyline. The fact is, the Rails nature of this game, that doesn't happen. And even the points where I think it could happen, that the story stays on what Rails it's on, it doesn't. Now, I realize that the amount of work that would have created for the developers would have been immense. All the different possible pathways would mean a lot more code for these scenarios, a lot more story to write, and they may not have had a budget for it. And I get that, I really do. But in the same breath, a lot of the decisions in this game seem to indicate the idea of you controlling the story, that you have the influence to make those elements, and quite frankly, it's very minimal here. And even then, it's pretty clear when those parts in the story happen. They basically prompt you at that point that there's a decision to be made. Once the game really got past the first few hours, I realized that I was not in charge of the ride here. Yeah, there may be alternate endings and choices to make, but really, I was being dragged along. And I didn't really feel that great when I realized that. I do wonder if there were plans for this and a lot more of the story though. Just things like the potion making that happens in the latter half of the game. It feels like you only use that mechanic like 3 times. And really, it doesn't feel like going through the effort of coding and creating that subgame would really be worth it in that case. But maybe it was supposed to be more intensive in the first designs, and it just got cut for time. I don't know why I feel this way. It's stuff like that that makes me feel like I got a good game here, but if it had the time and budget, it could have been a lot more than it was. I'll give the designers credit here, however, as they did have a vision for the game and stuck to it. It couldn't have been easy to stick with this UI and control design that they ultimately chose here, as I could see, even in other comments and reviews, that people don't necessarily find the controls of tools and interactions with the UI great here. I mean, and I will admit, it is somewhat awkward to go into your inventory to pull out a specific item and organize it when you don't need it anymore. It feels real cumbersome to move things around and even put clues in the archives at times. Hell, even plant organization can be troublesome, especially in the endgame when you're trying to find a specific plant and it's all just disorganized up there. But I believe that's purposeful. Part of the gameplay here is actually organizing and using your tools and paying attention to the details. The game specifically gives you colored tags, for example, and you could technically use those tags in space to organize the plants by named sections, and even the effects that plants have with the colored tags. If you're not careful and get flustered by moving things around, you may miss an important detail. And I think the developers wanted to capture the idea of dealing with the little things that a shop owner would deal with, even if they seem mundane on the surface. It seems like there was a lot of attention paid to this, and I don't think that's because they didn't have the tools to do it. It would have been easy to make an algorithm that just organized all the plants right then and there, but I think they chose not to, because that's part of the game. Actually, it sort of brings up the most interesting part of this review for me, and that's the overall reaction on Steam to the game. Yes, I do look at reviews if available when I do my review, but only after I've come up with a real solid idea of what I think of the game. So when I saw that the game was overly positive, actually having 1,000+ positive reviews and less than 50 negative ones, I was actually shocked. To me, I saw a game that had the distinct flavor of boom or bust, that you'd either love it or hate it. It had the earmarks of games that end up getting very divided over. A UI system that's clunky but purposeful, a game that gives the idea of choice but is actually on rails, certain elements that could easily irritate a lot of players. And many of those ideas were presented in the negative reviews, and hell, even in the positive reviews. So what exactly put the game over the top for players? Well, first, it was the atmosphere created. And I'll agree with this point. Sure, the game's cluttered UI and lack of detail on the character models can be off-putting at first, but what it's able to capture otherwise is an odd life to this plant shop. Simple choices like having the plants flow back and forth, or the light rain that could be in the background of a stained greenhouse, puts personality into the environment, telling its own tale. The effort was mostly put in the visual elements of the flowers. A lot of detail was put into the color, line, and shading work of these plants, and rightfully so. Small details like the stains on your workspace or the texture of an envelope helps ground you in this realistic world, even if some of the flowers may seem like they do crazy things. But it also knows when to hold back and be consistent, yet not too consistent, which some of these smaller mystery games forget at times. The encyclopedia is a great example of this, especially with the drawings in the book. The key in on specific parts of the plants. They're great, but it's the fact that the drawings change in slight detail ever so often, so that, yeah, the same person drew it, but the drawing was done at the moment the plant was found, and there will be inconsistencies in the shading and other elements, and it captures that nicely to help the storytelling. The atmosphere is helped by simple sound design that's effective and gives wonderful positive feedback, like the ringing of the bell for the next customer, or the unfolding of a letter to read. It's a game that I will say I noticed when I didn't have the sound on, because I ended up waiting or clicking on the wrong thing and then wondering what I did wrong, but if the sound was on, I would know almost immediately. In addition, the music is relaxing and haunting in ways as well, helping the mystery of the story unfold while still providing some ambiance overall. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. So okay, the first part of those reviews seem to be spot on. But what about the second? Well, many people point to the writing and the story, and that's where my opinion of the game, or at least parts of the game, differs a bit. The game has a strong mystery element embedded into these characters and plot lines, and there are several interwoven elements that do work well to pique your interest about these cults that pop up, these rituals, these interesting third parties. All the elements that still feel grounded in the game world, but make you wonder if any interaction has a deeper meaning to it, or your choices may have more consequences down the line. That's what a good mystery game should do, get you interested and still paying attention to the lower details, but wanting to see what's around the corner. The problem that pops up for me is that if you're not going to have the ability to really influence the story that much, as I mentioned before, you're really relying on the storytelling of your plot overall, what happens in it, and the characters that are involved. And while the game's plot goes to interesting places and discusses interesting aspects, I'm gonna be honest with you, I really kept forgetting which character was which at times name-wise, and quite frankly, there was something about the way this was written that had me really struggling to focus on the details. Which is odd, because I've played plenty of games that have been more complex and written with more colorful or difficult language in plenty of visual novels. And yet this game gave me struggles trying to remember certain plot points or even getting really interested in certain subplots. Now, that may be partly due to the way the game is constructed. Like, you give a plant to a character, they may come back later and update you on what happened with it, but it's usually in a piecemeal sort of presentation, similar to Papers, Please in some aspects. From what I remember, stories from minute to minute in Papers, Please had people who were one-offs at times, but you had key people that kept coming back and stories that would be built off them, but only a few you really had to juggle. Here, it felt like I was juggling the aspects of 5 or 6 people at a time, and it kept on jumping between them without being able to control that flow. And maybe my mind just shut down because of it. Maybe it's because I streamed the start and was too busy looking at other details that I didn't let it register like I should have. But I think the biggest problem I had was the writing style, not necessarily doing a great job of personalizing the characters. Now, some games have this problem, and you can get rid of it in many different ways. For example, voice acting can have writing that is written by one voice, but it turns into multiple voices with inflection, the actual reading, so on and so forth, so that you get the impression of different people. Not so here. The way Person 1 was written to Person 2, they may have different personality traits, but for me, it felt like the writing between each one was the same, and thus ended up being the same voice for me with all the other similarities. The fact is, the visual style isn't necessarily that much different from one person to another, and there's no different font or different color put onto a different character. It all feels like the same voice is giving you the story, and that just doesn't make sense for this plot. That's the odd thing, though. Was I bored with this writing? No. Is it bad? No. Is there plot points that I can point to that I hated and tell them to change it? No. But in the end, the overall impression just didn't leave that much of an imprint on me. The more interesting gameplay mystery overshadowed it in a lot of ways, as if the story was trying to keep up, but it couldn't. This may make it sound like I'm not recommending the game at all, or I didn't like it, and that's not the case. I'm glad I bought the game and played it. I will be honest and tell you that if the budget was higher, and more branching paths exist, more writing was there, and a few of those voice problems I just mentioned were shined up, we'd be talking about Strange Horticulture as the next Papers, Please. But I think it's worth your time at the right price with the right match of personality. It's the greatest example to date, yes, to date, of why I think my review system works a lot better than the normal review scoring scale. This game is so dependent on the player and the way they play and look at things that the objective score of the game, while still doing its best to isolate those elements, can only go so far. See, people are going to see my objective score, the 77 out of 100 on the screen, and may get angry at how low the score is. They'll point to the great atmosphere, the clever puzzle solving, and the freshness of a concept they say is a must-buy. They'll probably go and look at my other reviews and say, hey, you gave this an 80, and yet this blows it out of the water. But when I look at the game, and its inability to really capitalize on the whole choice element, the weirdness of the UI being thematically appropriate and good for the game, yet still a little bit frustrating, and an overall story that feels like a shadow of what it could have been, it's hard for me to see the game with anything but a niche audience. Ones that will love the niche concept will not find anything here that will turn them off in the puzzle mystery genre. but those who are looking into the genre for the first time, or even for the second or third, I see a game that could turn them off easily or feel like they overspent on it. It's no Obra Dinn, it's no Papers, Please for everyone, but it's great for a subset of audience, and that's why it's in the niche buy category. But again, that doesn't take into account my enhancer system, which tries to match your wants and gameplay needs to give you a more accurate score for you. And oh boy, this one has probably the most enhancers and dehancers in the history of this channel due to the nature of this game. I mean, just look at the screen. Look at it. I literally am writing the script knowing full well that however I present it on screen is going to be a nightmare, because where do I put all these enhancers? Needless to say, if you fall into a category strongly, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game falls in the buyability range for you. Coming up on the next on the channel will either be a 5-minute review of Rain on Your Parade or a first impressions of Ancient, depending on what I get done first. Quite frankly, it'll probably be the first impressions, but, subscribe to the channel to see, those videos coming up. Yeah, that was a great segue, Sean. Anyway, I do indie investigations over on Twitch. I'm probably going to be playing SIFU this week, a good amount. Yeah, I do try to do 2 or 3 games, but quite frankly, that one has my interest this week, so I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to it. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out. If you have any comments, leave them below, and I'll see you later.